Deborah Lee James, former Secretary of the U.S. Air Force and seasoned corporate board member, shares insights from leading one of the largest and most complex organizations in the world. Drawing on her experience across public service and the private sector, she discusses the importance of putting people first, fostering transparency, and building trust. In conversation with WAEPA CEO Shane Canfield, James reflects on lessons from influential mentors and challenging leadership moments, and offers practical guidance on authenticity, resilience, and navigating career growth in today's evolving public service landscape.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WAEPA. Today, I'm honored to welcome Deborah Lee James, the 23rd Secretary of the United States Air Force, former senior business executive, corporate board member, and author of Aim High, Chart Your Course, and Find Success. As Secretary, Deborah led one of the largest and most complex organizations in government, overseeing 660,000 personnel and a budget of nearly $140 billion. Beyond her groundbreaking public service, Deborah remains deeply engaged in leadership at the highest levels. She serves on a number of influential corporate and nonprofit boards, including Textron, Unisys, Noblesse, and the Atlantic Council, and contributes her perspective to organizations such as leanin.org and the MIT Lincoln Laboratory. It's that combination of public service and private sector leadership and ongoing mentorship that makes her such an important voice in leadership today. Deborah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Shane.
Throughout your career, you've served high-profile leadership roles in Congress, Pentagon. What first motivated you to go into public service?
Well, in my earliest days, let's say in high school, Shane, I was a news junkie. I loved reading the news. I loved reading the paper. And my original interest was foreign policy. In fact, the original area of government I wanted to enter was the State Department. I wanted to be a diplomat and prepared for it. I loved the idea of travel. I did a certain amount of travel. I had an older sister who worked for an airline, so a modest economic family like my family could afford to go once a year because we got the free standby passes. So these were some of my early motivations, but a key lesson learned from those early times is there are more than one thing in life that will interest a young person. And if you look at my resume, I've never been in the State Department and I never have been a diplomat because in fact, they didn't pick me when I applied. So I had to do what I call a bit of a zigzag and ended up in a, let's say, an adjacent career field, which turned out to be the best plan B ever.
So who influenced your leadership style the most over your course of career? Was it a colleague, public figure, somebody from your personal life? And what did you learn from them about leadership?
I honestly cannot boil it down to a single individual. I've had so many terrific mentors, and then I've had a couple of god-awful bosses. And something I always like to tell people is over the course of a career, you're going to have some of all of the above. And there's something to be learned from all of them. Interestingly, there's a lot to be learned from the bad bosses because you can see in motion the kinds of behaviors that you do not want to adopt. So it's really from my great mentors, I learned the importance of putting people first and making sure that you have the right people on the right jobs, that you influence or that you give them the opportunity to advance, that you give them good feedback, that you hopefully open doors and help them get to the next level. From bad bosses, I learned the importance of not micromanaging, of empowering people instead. I've learned to always explain the why. When you change course, you have to give people the context, the why. If you don't, you look as though you're being capricious and knee-jerk in your reactions. So it's really an amalgamation for me, but at the top of the pyramid, I always put people first because although technology and strategy and organizational constructs are extremely important, it's people that ultimately make it all happen or not happen.
Looking at your resume, SAIC, President of Technical and Engineering Sector, then Secretary of the Air Force, and then you've served on a whole bunch of boards, some of which are nonprofits. I'm just curious what you've seen the difference be between nonprofit and for-profit leadership at the board level and maybe at the staff level as well? And that's because WAEPA is a nonprofit. We're a large benefit trust. We have to make money, of course, but that mission-driven orientation versus for-profit. I'm just wondering, your observation, your participation in both kinds of organizations, do you see a difference there? And if so, what would that be for leadership roles?
Fundamentally, I don't really see a difference. If you peel back the onion, though, and look at what, for example, I have done as a nonprofit board member versus what I have done as a for-profit board member. In the nonprofit world, typically there is certain, or at least the nonprofits that I have been associated with, there's a fundraising aspect to it that does not exist in the corporate for-profit world for board members typically. Certainly both types of board members get into financial reviews. I would say you get more deeply into it in the for-profit world than at least I have in the nonprofit world. Of course, we have to always make sure that we can pay our bills and that we're growing and so forth, but it's a degree of perhaps a deeper dive in the for-profit world. And I would say the same for strategy. But fundamentally, I think in both cases, you have the duty of care. You're responsible for your pre-reads and making sure that you've done your homework, putting the organization's interests before any of your own self-interest. This is the same responsibility in the nonprofit as well as in the for-profit world.
Shifting back to some of the amazing positions you've had that are widely varied, and I believe you talk about this a little bit in your book, highly complex, massive, large scale organizations. You've done that in the private sector and the public sector. When you go into change as a new leader, there can be resistance to change. How do you deal with that in a leadership role?
The first thing I would say is it's hard, first of all, so there's no easy answers to that. But the mechanics of the way I try to go about it, the first thing I try to do is I try to do my homework in advance and know as much as I can understand and know about what the top priorities are for change. Then I try to figure out how do I want to state those priorities, those agenda items that are going to be my top priorities as I go in to a new organization. The priorities have to be broad enough so that the team itself will build the specifics of how to get things done. So it's sort of 2 or 3 visions of where we want to go for change, and then you have to step back and try to let the people do it. So it's first of all, know your priorities, and then try to schedule your calendar as much as you can, focused on those priorities, so that the small items of the day don't take up too much of your time. Obviously, they have to take up some of your time, but you have to prioritize your own calendar. So that's the first thing, know your own priorities. The second thing is, again, the people. You got to have the right people in the right jobs, and going into a major government position, you don't always have a tremendous amount of flexibility to pick your own people. For example, as Secretary of the Air Force, all of the political appointees were presidential appointees. Some of them were already there. Some of them I did have a hand in interviewing as people would change over and so forth. Same with the military officers that were working under me. Some of them were already there, but over time they would rotate out. I would have some ability to choose or have a say. But getting the right people in the right job, being clear with them what the expectations are, holding them accountable, but also helping to coach and helping to bring them along as we're all on this journey together. The other thing I think is very important to do is be transparent with people and bring whatever your top talents are to the job. So for example, the fact that I was a member of industry and I knew how to run program reviews and I knew the incentives that industry has when they're working with the government. This was a talent that I brought to the table that many of the people around me, they had never experienced that. So naturally, that was not a strong suit of theirs. I was not someone who had myself served in combat, served in uniform. So clearly that was not my talent. That's where I need to step back and listen very intently to others, but always bring my top talents to the table while appreciating and leveraging the talents of others. So that's kind of another thing that I would always try to do, and it's a lesson that I've learned in leadership. And then the final one I would give you is the importance of transparency. I think I mentioned that. Transparency and building trust. And the way you build trust is, number one, it's built over time, and it has to do with you do what you say and you say what you do. You follow through and you role model the types of behaviors that you expect from other people.
One of the things that's talked about a little bit in your book, Aim High, Chart Your Course, and Find Success. For everybody listening, please read this book. It's amazing. Something that's a curiosity to me, because it feels a little amorphous, but authenticity in leadership. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what does that mean to you? What do you, when you hear that phrase, when you talk about it, when you act out in your roles as a leader, what does authenticity mean to you?
To me, it means be transparent enough to admit that you don't know everything. Be reasonably transparent about yourself as a human being, because guess what? Everybody who you're counting on to come through in the workplace is also a human being. So, for example, when I was a leader, I would talk pretty openly about my family. You know, the fact that I was a mother, the fact that I had a period in my life where I was a single mother. I had been married and divorced. You know, real people go through real things in their private life. So to be reasonably transparent about that, part of that is authenticity, I think, as well. But mostly it's admitting that you don't have all the answers. You have the certain directions that you are leading the organizations, but you need the team to help you build it. And if you make a mistake, mistakes are made. They're made by the leader, just like they're made by individuals who support the leader. And so there has to be authenticity in admitting, hey, this wasn't the correct way to go. Let's pivot. Let's go somewhere in a different direction.
You have both private and public sector experience. Are there parallels, and others in government go from private sector to government and government to private sector? Do you have any thoughts on leadership for somebody in a transition in either direction? Do they need to change how they lead, their style, what they focus on, any of those areas where there's a difference in how the organizations run and are funded? Do you have any thoughts for somebody transitioning on one direction or the other?
I actually do. And of course, I have gone through those transitions myself. And the first point I would make is understand that it can be hard. It can be a bit jarring. There is maybe no playbook, although I'm sure there have been books written about these transitions. But for me, the top differences were the government, which is where I grew up. I went into the private sector later in my career. It's very hierarchical. And, you know, you don't necessarily talk to your boss's boss or your boss's boss's boss without permission. The private sector, on the other hand, is very flat. You know, everybody talks to everybody else, and it's much more familiar. At least in the military, everything is very, not only hierarchical, but it's very respectful. It's very formal. You know, people would never, for example, call me by my first name. It was always Ms. James or Madam Secretary. It's just the formality of it, whereas in the private sector, it's very different. The other thing that's very different in the private sector is how you are measured as being a successful employee or not. So there are measures of effectiveness and things like, does your unit have sufficient profitability? Has your unit grown its revenue sufficiently? What is your day's working capital? That's a measurement of cash management. So it's things like this, which are completely different from the way that people are typically measured in the private sector. So to understand how that goes and to understand further the levers that one can or cannot pull in order to try to make those things happen. This is to the extent I had any difficulties in the beginning. It was just getting all of this down pat. It was understanding it. It was getting in the groove with it, and then taking off from there.
There's a lot of talk right now. There's some initiatives coming out of OPM. There's been a lot of conversation about this over time for public service attracting more folks into public service, especially early career folks. I remember in my dad's era, the John Kennedy era, ask not what your country could do for you, but what you can do for your country. And there was a real migration of talent into federal government, and perhaps that needs some rebirth. And do you have any thoughts on that? If somebody's looking to start a leadership career in public service, what advice would you give them?
The first piece of advice I would give is don't put all your eggs in one basket. So, for example, don't do what I did. I put all my eggs in the one basket of the State Department, got terribly disappointed, started sending out resumes every other place I could find, many, many rejections, and finally I got the one acceptance, which in those days was with the Department of the Army. I would suggest applying for multiple jobs in multiple agencies in the beginning. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, because there are many, many important and interesting jobs to be found in the public sector. The second piece of advice I would give is be patient, because much as I hate to say it, it takes a long time to get through USA Jobs, to get actual interviews. The process still needs to be worked on to be made faster. Every major company that I'm affiliated with, and even small companies, they try to get people in the front door ever increasingly faster. And in the public sector, it just takes too long, and it gets very, very discouraging, and frequently people don't hear back at all. So that's where the patience has to come in. Be patient is my second piece of advice. And then the third piece of advice I would give is, regardless of what your training has been in school, be tech savvy. In other words, I was a liberal arts major, and I think there's still plenty of room for liberal arts majors in government and in the private sector. But nowadays, you've got to be technology conversant, even if you're not deeply, deeply technical. And you can get that through short courses. You could get that through reading books, but make sure that you're reasonably tech savvy, because it is an expectation nowadays. And then the last piece of advice I would give is I would apply to the private sector too. Again, in the spirit of don't put all your eggs in one basket. This has been a tough couple of years, or a tough year per se, in the public sector. There's been a lot of downsizing. There's been bad press over government shutdowns. Not that these things didn't happen in the past, but it's been, I think, a particularly tough year. So there may not be as many jobs out there as one might have hoped. So again, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Apply widely, and I would include the private sector in that basket, and then see what hits, because there's plenty of things that will interest you in life.
Is there a moment from your leadership career that was especially difficult, and what did you learn from that?
If I had to pick one thing I had to do when I was Secretary of the Air Force that was very difficult, and it was difficult because I guess I feared it would be deeply, deeply unpopular for me to do it. And as leaders, we're not supposed to want to be popular, but I think most of us want to be liked. Most of us want to be respected, obviously, but we mostly want to be liked as human beings. I had to make the decision whether or not to recall a retired 4-star general to active duty, to hold him accountable for a sexual assault case. This was a case that came to the light some years after the fact. It was not reported immediately. It was a situation in which a subordinate of this general felt pressured into having sexual relations, and it had passed the statute of limitations where it was no longer eligible for a court-martial, which of course is like a trial where this person would go before a jury of peers in the military system, and there'd be testimony and whatnot. That was no longer on the table. The only way to take action here was to recall this general and to demote him in retirement. And in other words, the penalty he would pay would be a certain amount of embarrassment, major embarrassment, and money, so that he would get less retired pay because he would no longer be getting pay as a 4-star. He'd be getting retired pay as a lesser official. I did it. I thought the evidence was overwhelming. It was a very long case file. I read it very carefully. I decided to go forward with it. And what did I learn from it? And in fact, the general was demoted. What I learned from it was, to the extent a decision is not popular, but it nonetheless is the right thing to do ethically in support of people who need that help, then it's worth whatever the unpopularity may be. And you know what? It turns out it wasn't even as unpopular as I thought, because even though you may make a certain category of people mad, other people sit up and take notice that, wow, this was maybe a hard thing to do, but it was the right thing to do. She's got guts.
I think that's wonderful. I love what you said about the ethical component here, because as leaders, we never want to lose that. We always have to stay ethically grounded, and it just gets tougher and tougher as you move up in your leadership roles. I think that's a wonderful story. Deborah, thank you for sharing your thoughts and experiences. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you.
This is Shane Canfield, CEO of WAEPA, reminding you to empower your team and embrace challenges. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.